No one wanted the broken widow until one man stood in the mud and said, "She is worth more than all of you." Dodge City, Kansas, 1889. The flood had left the town square in ruins. Mud clung thick to the undersides of wagon wheels, the stink of wet hay and spoiled grain drifting through the damp morning air. Vendors laid out what little they could salvage bruised apples that sagged at the skin-damp sacks of flour caked in sludge boots, turned upside down to dry in the pale sun. A dog nosed through the refuse, whining as townsfolk tried to pretend this was still a marketplace and not just the wreckage of their lives. Through the churn of voices and clatter of wheels, one wagon rattled louder than the rest. It limped into the square, one wheel cracked and wobbling, pulled by a weary mule. The driver yanked hard on the reins, jerking the beast to a stop in the center of the square. A hush followed, broken by his coarse laugh. "Here she is," the man barked, swinging an arm toward the back of the wagon. "A widow that eats more than she earns can't walk, can't bear children. Anybody want her, you can take her. Otherwise she'll sit for the dogs." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some stared outright, others looked away in shame. Sitting hunched in a crude chair fashioned from mismatched planks and iron wheels was Clara Whitfield. Her hair, unwashed, clung in tangled strands around her pale face. A thin wool blanket was drawn tightly around her shoulders, as though it were the last piece of herself she still possessed. She said nothing, though a faint tremor passed through her hands. Laughter rippled in the crowd. A boy whispered, "She looks like a broken doll." An old woman shook her head. "Poor thing. Pity's one thing, feedin's another. Who'd take her in?" Clara did not flinch. She sat upright, eyes fixed ahead, not on them, but through them, as though she saw herself from above, as a rescuer might look down at floodwaters, watching who drowned and who struggled. From the edge of the square, Jonas Mercer watched. He was taller than most, shoulders broad beneath a weathered brown coat, the brim of his hat shadowing eyes hardened by long years alone. He stood silent as the driver spat into the mud and prepared to leave her where she sat. Jonas stepped forward, boots splashing in the puddles. Without asking permission, he gripped the handles of Clara's chair. "She's not garbage," he said evenly. His voice carried across the square, low but unyielding. "I'll take her to my ranch." The man turned, scowling. "She's my family's property. She eats our bread, breathes our air. You think you can just haul her off?" Jonas did not let go. "She's breathing. That makes her a person. Not a mule for sale, not property to discard." The man jumped down from the wagon bed, his boots sinking into the muck. "You want her, you pay." Jonas finally released the handles long enough to face the crowd. His words cracked the silence like a gunshot. "If anyone here believes a human life is worth less than a horse, step forward and try to stop me." The marketplace stilled. A few men shifted uneasily, but no one moved. Jonas turned back, set his hands firmly to the chair, and began pushing. The driver cursed after him, but his voice sounded weak against the silence that followed. The crowd parted without resistance. Clara's hands tightened around the wool blanket, but she said nothing as Jonas wheeled her out of the square, the sound of the broken wagon fading behind them. For a long stretch, the only noise was the creak of wheels and the crunch of Jonas's boots on the damp road. The prairie stretched wide and endless before them, a flat horizon broken by the sway of tall grass. Clara finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Do you do this for attention?" Jonas did not glance down. "I don't need attention. I need to see you live." By the time they reached his ranch, the sun leaned low, painting the land in amber. The house was simple, a frame of weathered boards, its porch worn but sturdy. Jonas wheeled Clara up the packed dirt path onto the porch and through the door. The narrow hall smelled faintly of cedar and soap. At its end waited a small room. It was tidy, almost startlingly so. A single bed neatly made a chest at its foot, polished clean a narrow window open to the wheat fields. A folded quilt lay ready across the mattress. Even the oil lamp was trimmed and full as though someone had been preparing it for days. Clara looked from the bed to Jonas. "You had this ready." "I had a room," Jonas answered, simply easing her chair inside. "Now it's yours." Her jaw set. "I can manage." He nodded once. "I know." That evening, Clara insisted on moving herself from chair to bed. It took time, her arms shaking as she dragged her body across, but she refused his hand. She unpacked her single blanket, arranged her threadbare belongings atop the chest. Each movement was small, but fierce a declaration that she was not helpless. When the scent of food reached her, she realized she had not eaten since the morning. A knock came at the door. Jonas's voice was calm, unhurried. Supper. When she opened the door, a tray sat on the floor, a bowl of stew, a slice of bread thick as her palm, and a jar of water. Jonas was already walking down the hall, not waiting for thanks, not intruding. The pattern repeated in the days that followed. Each meal came the same way, one knock a tray at the door, footsteps retreating unless she called. He never entered without her leave, never spoke more than she allowed. And slowly, Clara felt something stir. Not gratitude exactly, and not hope. Those were too heavy, too sharp. What she felt was steadiness, a ground beneath her feet she no longer had. For the first time since the flood, she believed she might not be discarded again. Clara woke with the pale light of morning streaming through the narrow window. For a moment, she thought she heard the roar of the flood again, the river breaking its banks, the crushing weight of water. But when she opened her eyes, it was only the sound of wind moving through wheat. The quiet of Jonas Mercer's ranch was so complete, it almost unnerved her. She wheeled herself to the doorway, her arms still sore from the effort of moving the night before. Outside, she could hear him working the scrape of a shovel against dirt, the rhythmic thud of wood being stacked. He hadn't once entered her room since bringing her home. The space was hers inviolate, and that strange respect unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. At midday, she discovered another tray left by the door. Fresh cornbread, a tin cup of coffee, and a jar of beans cooked with bacon. The smell was so rich, it made her stomach twist. For a long while, she simply stared, half expecting him to come back and watch her eat. But his footsteps faded toward the barn, leaving her alone. That evening, as she struggled to lift herself from the chair to the bed, she realized Jonas had left a folded handkerchief on her pillow. Old, but clean its edges embroidered with the careful stitch of a woman's hand. A single initial was sewn in faded thread M. She wheeled herself to the porch, the handkerchief clenched in her fist. Jonas sat on the steps oiling the hinges of the screen door, his hat tipped back. "This is yours," she said, holding it up. "It was my mother's," he replied without glancing away from his work. "Why give it to me?" He set the oil can aside, meeting her eyes at last. "Because maybe no one's asked you how you want to live. This says you've got something of your own here, even if it's just a piece of cloth." For the first time in weeks, Clara felt her shoulders loosen. She turned the handkerchief over in her hands, feeling the ridges of stitches worn soft by years of use. From that day forward, she began to roll her chair onto the porch in the mornings. She watched Jonas feed the hens, mend fences, check the corral. At first, she said nothing, only observing. But soon, when he passed by, he would tip his hat. "Morning, Miss Clara." The first time, she almost laughed, not because it was humorous, but because the sound of her name spoken without pity was strange and almost foreign. It had been so long since anyone called her by name, as though she still mattered. "Mornin'." She finally managed her voice stiff from disuse. One afternoon, Jonas placed a shallow wooden box across her lap. "Carry eggs this way," he said, showing her how to scatter grain wide enough so the smaller hens could get their share. Clara found herself smiling faintly as the birds darted around her, their feathers brushing against her skirt. Another day, Jonas knelt in the garden row, turning soil with his hands. "You ever plant?" "Not since I was a girl." "It's the same as then," he said. He pressed a seed into her palm. "Only now you do it sitting down." The dirt was cool against her skin as she dropped it into the hole. She covered it, patted it firm, and for the first time in years felt the strange sensation of planting something that might grow. Their quiet routine deepened into something Clara hadn't expected trust. She began to look forward to the mornings, to the way he would nod at her, with no expectation, no judgment. She began to feel as though she had space to breathe, and in that breathing room the first fragile shoots of hope began to push upward. But not everyone shared Jonas's view. One hot afternoon, the sound of hooves carried across the yard. A man in a dust-stained coat rode up and dismounted his boots, crunching on the dry earth. He carried himself with the arrogance of someone used to taking what he wanted. Clara's chest tightened the moment she recognized him, her late husband's uncle, Henry Vaughn. "You?" he said, pointing at her as though she were a misplaced object. "You're coming with me." Jonas emerged from the stable, wiping his hands on a rag. His voice was flat. "State your business." Henry pulled a folded sheet of paper from his coat. "She was left on our property. Family property. This says she's to be returned, worth a debt's payment." Clara gripped the arms of her chair, her pulse hammering. "I am not." But Jonas was already between them, his shadow falling long across the yard. One hand rested on his revolver, though it remained holstered. "In this place," he said evenly, "property doesn't breathe. And she's breathing just fine." Henry's lip curled. "That paper's legal." "Then take it to someone who cares more for ink than blood," Jonas replied. His voice didn't rise, but its weight pressed down on the air. Henry glanced at Clara, then back at Jonas. His eyes glinted with warning. "You'll regret crossing us," maybe Jonas said, "but not today." For a long moment, Henry considered. Then he swung back onto his horse, muttered a curse, and rode off in a trail of dust. Clara's hands loosened from the arms of the chair, but her heart still pounded. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "Yes," Jonas said quietly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "I did." She swallowed hard, staring at him. "That's twice you've pulled me out of the fire." Jonas turned to her, then his expression softening in a way that startled her. "Then maybe it's time we stop letting folks throw you in." Clara looked away, blinking against the sudden burn in her eyes. She had not wept when abandoned in the marketplace, nor when dragged through mud by her kin. But something about his words cracked a dam inside her. She clenched the handkerchief in her fist until her knuckles whitened. She would not let him see the tears, but for the first time in her memory, she no longer felt alone. The weeks passed in a rhythm Clara had never known. She woke with the sunrise pouring through her window, rolled herself to the porch, and watched Jonas begin his day. He never asked her to help, never suggested she was a burden, yet slowly he wove her into the fabric of ranch life. It started with simple tasks. Feeding the hens had once seemed impossible from her chair, but Jonas had shown her how to scatter the grain wide so the smallest birds weren't crowded out. He built a shallow crate that balanced neatly on her lap, allowing her to carry eggs without spilling them. At first, her hands trembled, afraid of dropping the shells, but soon the crate felt like an extension of herself. She marveled at how something so small, holding a few eggs, could feel like reclaiming a piece of her strength. Then came the garden. Jonas set her near the rows he'd plowed, pressing seeds into her palm. She dug tiny holes with a stick, lowering each seed, carefully covering them with soil. The earth was cool and rich against her fingers. It soothed her in a way she hadn't expected, as though planting something meant planting herself back into the world. One evening, Jonas disappeared into the barn. She heard the hammering of nails, the scrape of saw blades. 2 days later, he wheeled a contraption into the yard, the scent of pine wood fresh on it. "What is that?" Clara asked, suspicion and curiosity warring in her voice. "A frame," Jonas said, patting the polished pine. It was bolted to a saddle shaped almost like half a chair. Locks into the stirrups. "Thought you might want to ride again." Her throat tightened. "I haven't been on a horse since—" "I know." His eyes softened, though his tone remained steady. "But if you want to try this, we'll hold you steady. And if you fall, then I fall with you. We get back up together." She drew a deep breath. Her fingers clenched the armrests of her chair. For a moment, she saw only the river, the current that had stolen her legs. But then she looked at Jonas, and the steadiness in his gaze made her nod. "I will try." With his help, she transferred into the saddle. The frame locked tight around her hips, keeping her upright. The mare shifted beneath her, patient and warm. Her heart pounded, but Jonas stayed close, his hand steady on the reins. "Take them," he said. She gripped the leather. The mare moved forward each step, rocking her body. It was awkward at first, jerky, but as the horse found her rhythm, so did Clara. A smile broke across her face before she could stop it. By the third lap of the yard, she felt alive in a way she hadn't since before the flood. Then the mare stumbled on a rut. The frame tilted, and Clara pitched sideways, crashing to the ground. Dust filled her mouth, pain scraped through her palms. She rolled to her elbows, glaring up at Jonas. "Are you going to stand there?" He cocked his head. "Do you need my hand?" She hesitated, then shook her head fiercely. Not yet. 3 times she tried, and 3 times she failed before finally dragging herself back into her chair. Her arms shook, her skirt was torn, but her voice was iron. Again. Jonas studied her, not with pity, but with quiet calculation. Then he nodded. "All right." They tried again. And again. Each fall hurt, but each fall hardened her resolve. By sundown, she was drenched in sweat, her braid unraveling, her hands raw. Yet in her eyes burned something new, something fierce. That night, Clara sat by the window, mending her apron. Across the room, Jonas worked silently, her riding skirt spread across his lap. He threaded a needle carefully, his stitches neat if slow. She watched him, astonished. "You can sew?" she asked. "My mother taught me," he said without looking up. "Said a man who can mend his own clothes won't ever go begging." "You didn't have to fix it," she murmured. "I know." He tied off the thread, smoothed the fabric, and set it aside. Their eyes met in the lamplight. It wasn't pity she saw there. It wasn't charity. It was respect. The next days settled into a pattern of labor and small victories. Jonas split wood in the crisp air while Clara pushed herself harder, practicing transfers from chair to bed chair to saddle. She sewed patches into his shirts, her stitches crooked beside his careful ones, but he wore them without complaint. At night, they spoke in low voices about weather, about the prairie, about memories of lives before loss. But the world outside did not forget them. One afternoon, Jonas left for town, promising to return by dusk with sacks of seed. Clara was alone except for the chickens in the yard and the mare swishing flies in the corral. She was peeling potatoes at the kitchen table when movement flickered at the edge of the fence line. 4 riders. They came, slow, scanning the ranch as if it were already theirs. The tallest, in a gray coat, dismounted and walked toward the porch. 2 drifted toward the corral, their eyes on the mare. Clara's stomach clenched. She slid the bolt across the door, then glanced at the rifle hanging by the window. Jonas's words echoed in her memory. "Keep the doors barred and do not open for anyone." Her fingers wrapped around the rifle stock. It was heavier than she expected, the barrel cold against her hands. She wheeled to the window, eased it open, and slid the barrel through. "Anyone home?" The man in the gray coat called, his voice mocking. "Looks quiet. Maybe we just help ourselves." One of his men reached for the barn latch. Clara aimed low and squeezed the trigger. The crack shattered the quiet dust, jumping at the man's boots. He staggered back, swearing. "Hell, who's shooting?" Clara racked the lever, her voice steady though her heart thundered. "The next shot isn't the ground." The man sneered, but when she fired again, splintering a fence post inches from his hand, he stepped back. The others froze, eyes darting. "Lady, you've got no call." Another crack split the air-clipping grass near the corral. The mare stamped nervously. That was enough. The men swung into their saddles and rode hard for the horizon, dust boiling in their wake. Clara kept the rifle steady until they were nothing but specks. Only then did she lower it, her hands shaking. She set it across her lap and exhaled slowly. When Jonas returned near dusk, he noticed the tang of gunpowder before he saw the gouges in the dirt and the shattered fence post. Inside, Clara sat at the table, knife in hand, peeling potatoes as if nothing had happened. The rifle leaned against the wall. Jonas's eyes swept the room. "What happened?" 4 men came for the barn and the horses, she said simply. "And you stopped them." She shrugged. "I didn't stop them. I protected my home." Jonas studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled slow, genuine, a rare warmth breaking through the stern lines of his face. "Remind me never to cross you, Miss Clara." Her lips curved faintly. "You're safe. You're not stealing my grain." He chuckled softly, shaking his head, and turned toward the window. The yard was quiet again, but Jonas knew something had shifted. Clara was no longer merely surviving. She was defending. The rain came that night, without warning, sweeping across the prairie in silver sheets that rattled the tin roof. Jonas sat on the porch steps, lantern at his side casting a warm circle of light, while the rest of the yard dissolved into shadow and storm. He hadn't expected Clara to appear, but the creak of her wheels came soft through the doorway. Wrapped in a shawl, she rolled close enough to see him through the rain's curtain. "You'll be soaked through," she said. "I don't mind." His voice was quiet, as steady as the rain itself. They listened together. The smell of wet cedar drifted in with the wind. Clara gripped the edge of her shawl, thinking he might speak of chores, of tomorrow's tasks. Instead, his voice broke the silence with words that surprised her. "There was a time I wanted to quit living." Her breath caught, though she said nothing. "After my mother died," Jonas went on, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the porch. "I was 19. She caught a fever nothing the doctor could do. I thought I could keep the ranch running, but the cattle starved that winter. The fences rotted. Everything I touched seemed to die. Every night, I'd sit out here listening to the coyotes, wondering if it'd be better to just stop." The rain filled the quiet between them. Clara tightened her hands on the armrests. "Have you ever thought like that?" he asked softly. Her eyes dropped. The flood returned to her in a rush, the black water, the current that had ripped her life away. "The day of the river," she whispered. "My husband was outside shouting for me to take the high trail. I saw him slip. I went after him. The water was freezing. It took my breath. I grabbed his coat once, but the river tore it from my hands. Next, I knew I was on the bank. My legs. She swallowed. They weren't mine anymore. He was gone, and half of me was gone with him. Jonas turned toward her, his elbows resting on his knees. You were still in the water when you lost the use of your legs. She nodded. But I kept swimming. I don't know why. Maybe because stopping felt worse. For a long moment, the rain was louder than either of them. Then Jonas said quietly, "You're stronger than I'll ever be." Clara's gaze lifted to his, her voice steady. "Then be strong with me." The words lingered in the air, steady and sure. Jonas rose from the steps, crossed to her, and crouched at her side. Close enough that she could see raindrops clinging to his beard, close enough to feel the warmth of him against the cold night. He hesitated only a heartbeat before placing his hand over hers. It wasn't the touch of a rescuer to the rescued. It wasn't pity. It was the grip of someone who recognized another survivor. Clara let her hand turn beneath his, curling her fingers around his. In that moment, she felt not fragile, but fierce. She had been dragged through loss and mud, and still she lived. They stayed that way until the lantern sputtered from damp. When Jonas finally stood, he said nothing, only nodded once, as though the words between them were already understood. But Clara felt them in her chest, deep and certain. They were no longer two broken people clinging to scraps of survival. They were becoming something together. The next mornings brought a new sound to the ranch, the scrape of saw against wood, the thud of hammer on nails. Jonas rose before dawn and worked long after dusk. From her window, Clara watched as he measured planks, sank posts into the earth, framed something she couldn't yet name. On the third day, she wheeled herself outside, curiosity gnawing at her. "What are you building?" she asked. "You'll see," he said with a half smile. 2 days later, he knocked on her door. "Come outside." The air was crisp, carrying the smell of damp soil and cedar shavings. Jonas pushed her chair across the yard toward the new structure. Morning sunlight streamed through the slanted roof, spilling warmth over a long trough of turned earth. Clara blinked. "What is it?" "The best light on the ranch," Jonas said, stepping back so she could see. He held out a small sack of seeds. "For sunflowers. You told me once they were your favorite." She remembered she'd spoken it in passing one winter night when they'd talked about things they missed. She hadn't thought he was listening. Jonas placed the sack in her lap. "This is your patch, your garden." Her fingers brushed the paper, then dug into the soil. The dirt crumbled rich and dark between her hands. Something inside her loosened as she pressed the first seed into place, covered it, and patted it down. Jonas fetched water she planted. Together, they worked in silence until the trough was lined with seeds. When they finished, she sat in the center of the patch, her hands stained brown, her hair falling loose around her face. The sun warmed her shoulders. For the first time in years, she didn't reach for her shawl to cover herself. Jonas leaned against a fence post, watching her. There was something unguarded in her smile, something alive. "You look—" He stopped searching. Clara raised an eyebrow. "I look what?" "Alive," he said finally. Her smile softened, though she looked away, letting the sun rest on her face. Jonas stepped closer, his shadow stretching beside her. One hand rested on the back of her chair. His voice was low, steady. "Clara, if you ever need a name to sign on a letter, I'd like it to be mine." Her breath caught. She turned, searching his face. "I don't have a ring," Jonas went on. "I don't have speeches. But I have this land. I have what I feel for you. If you want my name, it's yours." For a heartbeat, silence. Only the sound of a meadowlark in the distance. Clara's eyes brimmed, but instead of breaking, her smile grew. Jonas Mercer, she said, tasting the name. That would make me Clara Mercer. Jonas's lips curved, his hand tightening over hers. That would make me whatever you want me to be. Tears slid warm down her cheeks, but she didn't hide them. Yes, she whispered. He squeezed her hand, the grip firm and sure. Good. Then we'll tell the sunflowers when they bloom. They stood there together, her in her chair, him beside her, watching the morning light stretch across the soil. The seeds lay hidden beneath the earth, but Clara felt as though something had already begun to grow. By the time the frost lifted from the ground, Clara's garden had begun to stir with life. Tiny shoots broke the soil, fragile, but determined, much like the woman who had planted them. Every morning she wheeled herself out to the trough of earth, loosening soil with her fingers, watering with careful patience. Jonas worked nearby, mending fences, tending livestock, always within sight. The ranch no longer felt like an empty stretch of land. Word spread quietly through the county that Jonas Mercer's home was different. He hadn't planned it, but somehow the broken and castaway began to find their way there. First, a fever-orphaned boy who wandered up the road, then a widow whose kin had turned her out, then a soldier too old to work the cattle drive but not ready for the poorhouse. Jonas never asked their stories. Clara did. She wrote each name in a worn leather journal beside a note of the first thing that made them smile again. One page read, "This is the place where women sleep without fear." By spring, the yard bustled with life. Women hung laundry in the breeze, children darted between sheds. The old soldier hammered fence posts with steady rhythm. Jonas trained a girl no taller than his shoulder to ride his hand, steadying her reins, his voice calm. Across the garden, Clara taught young women to plant seedlings in neat rows, her hands guiding theirs. "He's patient with her," one of the girls remarked, nodding toward Jonas with the child. Clara smiled. "He's always patient with those who think they cannot." At midday, the smell of baking bread drifted from the kitchen, mingling with laughter and the creak of barn doors. What had once been a lonely ranch had become something else, something chosen. But the past had not entirely let go. Late one afternoon, a lone rider appeared on the ridge. Clara felt her stomach tighten as soon as she saw the pinched mouth and narrow shoulders. Henry Vaughn, her late husband's uncle, had returned. He rode into the yard without greeting, his gaze sweeping over the cluster of people. "I hear you've collected quite a household," he sneered. His eyes settled on Clara. "And my nephew's widow still living on your charity." Jonas stepped forward, blocking Clara from view. "You heard right. I came for what's mine," Vaughn said. "She was married into my family," he began. Jonas cut him off, his voice low and steady. "You won't like the end of that sentence." The man's jaw worked. He glanced around the yard and saw not just Jonas, not just Clara, but a dozen faces watching him. The old soldier with his arms crossed by the fence. The young women holding garden tools like weapons. Even the little girl in the saddle, Jonas's rifle balanced awkwardly across her lap. Vaughn's gaze faltered. He yanked his reins hard. "Keep her." Then he muttered and rode away without looking back. When the dust settled, Clara exhaled slowly, her hand gripping the armrest of her chair. Jonas turned, his expression easing. "He won't come again, I know," she said quietly. That evening, she wrote in her journal, "I was once left in a marketplace like a broken thing. But one man saw me, not the legs I lost, but the heart that did not break." Seasons turned. Clara's determination did not falter. Every day she pushed harder against the limits of her body. Doctors had said there was little hope for movement below her waist, but Jonas never repeated their doubts. He simply stood by her side, steady as the porch rail she clung to. One morning, as autumn light slanted gold across the yard, Clara felt a faint tremor in her thigh. Her breath caught. Jonas was at her side instantly, his hand anchoring her elbow as she gripped the rail. Again she whispered. Through summer into fall she practiced. One step, then two. Her progress was slow, but each victory was hers. At night, Jonas lifted her gently into bed. At dawn, he was there to steady her when she rose. Together, they built strength one moment at a time. And then, on a cool afternoon, Clara crossed the yard on her own. Her steps were halting, her body trembling, but each foot found earth. Jonas turned from the woodpile, the axe slipping from his hands in shock. Jonas, Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. We're going to have a child. For a heartbeat, silence. Then he caught her up in his arms, spinning her until laughter burst from her lips. When he set her down, his forehead rested against hers, breathless. You've given me 2 lives today, he whispered. No, she said softly, her hands at his neck. We gave them to each other. The sun dipped low, painting the fields gold. And on the Mercer Ranch, what had begun as survival had become something greater. Years later, the sunflowers Clara planted grew tall, their bright heads turning toward the sky. Children played between them, their voices carrying across the fields. Travelers who came to the ranch found more than food and shelter, they found a promise. This was not just Jonas Mercer's ranch anymore. It was Clara's, too. It was the place where castaways became family, where the broken found soil to bloom again. And Clara knew as she watched the faces around her that she had not been rescued. She had been seen. She had been believed in. And from that, a life had been rebuilt, not weaker, but stronger. The story of Clara and Jonas isn't about pity or rescue. It's about the courage to keep moving when the world says you're finished. It's about refusing to measure worth by what's lost, and instead building strength from what remains. Life will break us all in different ways. But broken does not mean worthless. Sometimes the very fractures become the places where courage grows strongest. Clara's steps across the yard, her laughter after years of silence, her journal filled with names of the forgotten. These remind us that true strength is not in standing tall without struggle, but in rising again and again with those who choose to stand beside us. And perhaps that's the greatest truth of all. Love is not rescue. Love is the steady hand that says, you are enough, and we will keep going together. If this story touched, you share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. Leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe for more tales of resilience, love, and second chances under the wide western sky. Because out here, every heartbeat is worth telling.